Okay, we'll start here in the room first. Kyria?
So, given the fact that the way the budget has been blocked out by the legislature, I understand that UAF and UAA are going to be taking the brunt of this cut because UAS and community campuses have been separated out into two appropriations. How is this cut therefore going to affect UAF and UAA?
You're right. There are two appropriations in this budget. One is for UAS Southeast and the community campuses across the state. The other is UA Fairbanks, UA Anchorage, and statewide administration. And the veto applies to that latter category of the universities. We will be working through the reduction planning and looking at both of those appropriations. Our community colleges, community campuses across the state, and our universities for that matter, do not bear all of the cost of their operation. A lot of those costs are borne by statewide administration. Let's look, for example, at the Community and Technical College here in Fairbanks. Its funding would be in this separate appropriation not subject to the veto, and yet many of its expenses are borne by UAF and the system office. And so we'll need to work through all of those costs that are actually borne by other entities than are actually impacted by the veto. So it's a complicated process there, but we'll be going through that process as well. So the appropriation that was not vetoed is not secure. I guess that's a way to put it, right? It will have to pick up additional costs that it's not now picking up. So there will be a definite impact on that side as well.
Talking with KTPF, what do you want to tell students and staff right now?
Well, I want to thank them for all their hard work, their commitment to, in my view, the single most important institution in Alaska. Now, I'm biased, I get it, but there is no strong state, there is no strong economy in the world that doesn't have a strong higher education institution or strong higher education system. So I want to thank them for voting with us in terms of studying here or teaching here or doing their research here or providing support services here. If we're successful in getting the veto overridden, then I think we'll be in strong shape and there won't be a negative impact on our institutions and on our mission of service to Alaska. If, however, this veto goes forward and is not overridden, students will be impacted. Faculty will be impacted, staff will be as well. A preliminary rough estimate is that we would need to reduce 1,300 faculty and staff across the university system. So that's a huge impact because we're largely a people organization and it's our people who deliver those programs and those services to our students. So there's no question that it would interfere with our students' educational process and their careers. I can't sugarcoat this. I can't say that a veto like this, a huge 41% budget cut, can be isolated without serious impact on our programs and services. That would just not be honest with our students, with our people, with our communities. Again, we have a terrific university here, and we face challenges, no question, and this is an historically unprecedented challenge that we've been given. I'm very hopeful that we'll make our case very effectively over the next couple of weeks, and that this decision will be overridden.
Looking to cut any programs or athletics?
Everything is on the table. 41% of our state funding was vetoed today. So there's no question. Campuses, academic programs, you name it, it must be on the table. This is a huge number.
President Johnsen, given that number was in Governor Dunleavy's original proposed budget, why wasn't it planned for? Why wasn't there a scenario?
There is no plan to take a 41% cut. If a patient is ill and needs medical care or physical therapy, you don't begin planning on the amputation right out of the chute, right? You try to help the patient through physical therapy or exercise or something like that, or dieting, whatever it might be, right? That's all fine, and our plans that we had prepared for the board repeatedly over the spring, that we shared with the legislature, that we were ready to push a button on had we received the legislature's budget, which did have a modest cut in it. And we actually had several other scenarios planned out. But this is not something you can plan for, I don't believe. Another metaphor might be, you can plan for a gradual landing on an airplane. Very, very difficult to plan for the crash.
So you never really took it seriously that he would actually follow through on it?
I think we took it really seriously, but there's no way to rationally plan for a cut of that impact. That's almost all of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. It's almost all of the University of Alaska Anchorage. It's 4 to 5 times all of our community campuses.
So given that, how much energy do you put into now planning for it versus advocating for the override?
Well, it's going to be an ambidextrous process, and so we're going to be advocating hard, and also we'll be doing the contingency planning as well. Now, one of the things I would say is that as we developed scenarios over the last several months, and as we went through our strategic pathways process, as we set our goals and developed initiatives in support of our goals, we have learned a lot about ourselves. So we know where the money is, we know where the programs are, we know where the enrollment is, and so I think we can fairly expeditiously go through that evaluation process. Unfortunately, if the veto is upheld, we will not have the time to really take and do a deep analysis. We're going to have to move very, very quickly, because every day we don't make a decision, we have to cut even deeper, because these reductions have to be absorbed within the year.
And can it be a partial override, or is it either the 5 million or the 100 and...
Right, it's 5 million or 134 million. Yep.
What is your message to Governor Dunleavy?
I really don't have a message for Governor Dunleavy at this point. We did talk today, and I thanked him for his call. I let him know that if this is upheld, there'd be about 1,300 fewer people working for the University of Alaska, and that this would have a very negative impact on the state's economy and the state as a whole for many years to come.
All right, I'd like to go down to Juneau for some questions. I've got Ben and Becky down there if one of you have a question.
Yeah, was curious. Today, the governor said that in light of these cuts, the University of Alaska cannot be or continue to be all things to all people. I was wondering if you could speak to the value of comprehensive programs.
Well, sure. That's a good question. First off, we are not all things for all people. There are many degree programs that we don't provide because we're a relatively small university. There are programs that are only available at one of our universities or another one of our universities that are not available all across the state. I think also we've done a really good job of making programs at one university available to people all across the state through distance technology. We have over 30 completely online degree programs available now to Alaskans. So we've made a lot of those kinds of reductions over the last several years. We had 3 management schools when I got here. We now have 2. We've reduced grants and contracts processes and procurement offices and all sorts of things like that through our strategic pathways process. If this veto is upheld, then I think the options and choices for Alaskans will become even more limited. And so we will do our best, no question about it. You know, we've been here 100 years, we'll be here in 100 years. But it'll be a serious impact and a real reduction, in my view, in the options, the choices, the accessibility that Alaskans now have for the benefits of higher education, the benefits that only higher education can provide in terms of higher incomes, in terms of health status, in terms of employment prospects, in terms of how your family does, how your kids do in their school in the future. So all of those things, I think, are at stake. And if we're going to build a state we can be proud of, we've got to have a university system we can be proud of.
Hi, this is Becky Bohr with the Associated Press. I had two clarifying questions. First, you had mentioned earlier if in the event of an override, it's $5 million or $134 million, but the governor's office said $130 million was his veto, so I wanted to clarify that number.
Sure, it's 130 from the legislature's budget. So the 134 number, it's a good question, is the difference between the current year budget and next year's budget. So you're correct, the 130 is from the budget approved by the legislature, which is $5 million less than last year.
And then when you mentioned the 1,300 staff, out of how many? I mean, how significant is that number itself?
Well, that would be full-time equivalent. I'm going to estimate maybe 3,000 full-time faculty and staff right now. So, you know, it's about 41%. We're mostly a people organization. So that's the estimate there. Now, we've already eliminated close to 1,300 people over the last 4 years. That includes part-time, full-time, etc. This 1,300 is an estimate. It actually is based on an ICER, Institute of Social and Economic Research estimate, where they assume roughly 10 positions per $1 million reduction. And they built that into their economic impact models this year. And so that's where we get that estimate.
And just one last question. There were groups I know there was an effort to try to deal with the governor's office on an agreement on the ferry system, for example. Did the university have any discussions with the governor's office in any effort to try to mitigate the level of these vetoes? And if so, can you talk about the nature of those talks?
Absolutely, Becky. It's a great question. The governor and his team and I met, I would say, probably 5 times over the last several months, where we presented our case, where we presented options for the future, where we presented additional data, where his Office of OMB was extremely selective in the data that they were using to compare our costs with other state higher education costs. So those meetings I thought were very constructive. I would say that he has been supportive of our efforts to remedy our long-time land grant deficit. So that's, again, one area of cooperation, and I do appreciate that because I do think we're going to make some progress on that front here in the near term. That won't benefit us over the next 2 weeks or probably over the next 2 years, but 10 years from now, we may look back and say that was very helpful, and the university is able now to rely for its revenue more from lands than other sources. But that said, there wasn't any negotiation at all with the governor's office. It was mostly yours truly advocating for the interests of the university and the state in those conversations.
Hey, let's go up to Anchorage. Questions from there?
This is Tegan with the Anchorage Daily News. President Johnson, I guess I have a follow-up question, but just first, I guess a simple yes or no question. Has the University of Alaska declared financial exigency before?
No.
And can you kind of help us understand what exactly that means and what the impacts are?
Sure, it's a good question, Tegan. It is not, repeat, not bankruptcy. So don't conflate the two. People often do. Financial exigency is a provision in Board of Regents policy which allows the university to expedite reductions, to modify particularly employment contracts, to reduce notice periods and other requirements prior to making reductions. So instead, for example, of providing a year's notice to a tenured faculty member that his or her position has been terminated, that notice period is 60 days. Instead of going through a very extensive planning process and evaluation process for making the decision, that's not required under financial exigency. So it's a way, again, of empowering university decision makers to implement decisions much more quickly. It certainly has negative implications, hits to our reputation, for one, should be expected. So it's a tool that we've never used. It's very rarely used by public universities, although some have in recent years in response to budget cuts. But given a number this big and the need to capture those savings as quickly as we'll need to, there is probably no other option.
This is Shannon Ballard with KTVA. So has financial exigency been declared already, or are you just preparing to prepare should you need to?
The latter, Shannon. So we're going to come back and meet with the Board of Regents on July 15th. If the legislature overrides the governor's veto, it'll be a moot point. We'll just adopt the budget that was approved by the legislature. If, however, the veto is not overridden by the legislature, we'll be ready to put before the board a declaration of financial exigency.
This is Tegan again, and then does the board have to approve that declaration?
Yes, it does, Tegan. Yes.
And can I ask one other question? President Johnsen, can you just talk to us a little bit about, I think it was today, your initial reaction of hearing or reading the governor's veto for UA funding? Like, how did it compare to what you expected? What was, like, your initial, reaction?
Well, as I said to the board, I'd been working with the team here at the university for weeks on this meeting and plans for different scenarios, all assuming rationality, all assuming our ability to manage, difficult though it would be at $30 million, $40 million, $50 million vetoes. So all of those plans and all of the decisions that we would tee up to the board would be difficult, no question, but they were manageable, I think. And so once we heard the number, it really shocked and I think removed that assumption from the table. It's a rational approach can't be taken, an approach that reduces or minimizes impact on students can't be taken. Just finding nickels and dimes can't be successful. Not impacting people is not sufficient given the huge number that the governor vetoed from our budget. So that's so I didn't walk through the presentation that I had and my team had spent many hours preparing because it was frankly useless to go through all of that.
President Johnsen, this is Matt Buxton with the Midnight Sun. Can you talk a little bit about the timeline at which sort of decisions be made under financial exigency as far as, deciding what programs to eliminate, and how does that compare to, I guess, the normal process, like the strategic pathways that you guys have been considering that, could also potentially lead to elimination or consolidation of programs?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. I appreciate it. If you were to look at the board's package today, where we were assuming much more modest reductions, you would see there a process that we laid out for the board that had a possible declaration of financial exigency in October 1st. And it was at that time also that we planned to be done with doing what we call exceptional expedited program reviews. So we would actually walk through and identify, 30, 40, some number of academic programs that we would review over the August timeframe. The plan called for public input and involvement of faculty during the month of September, and then board action in October. And that's light speed reviews. Typically, reviews take a much longer period of time, and that's why we call them exceptional and expedited. In this case, we won't have that time. If this veto is not overturned, then we have to make decisions much more quickly. And so the plan would be to get the board's approval of financial exigency on July 15th, with some detail as to what the reductions would be, and then to return to the board at the end of the month, end of July, with real detail as to what programs would be discontinued or eliminated. So it's very fast track compared to a very calm, deliberative process.
Would this exigency affect things like teach-out requirements? So for people that are already in these programs that are a couple years in, what would happen to them potentially? And I know we're getting kind of down to the roots here, but
no, it's a really good question, and it goes to one of the ways in which our students would be impacted, and the work that we must go through to minimize the negative impacts on students. We have an obligation to students to help them complete their programs, to teach them out, as we say it in our business. And if we're ending programs, then we'll have to figure out, are there alternative programs within the University of Alaska system to which those students could be transferred? Are there online opportunities within the University of Alaska system that could meet those students' needs? Those are examples of ways in which teach-out requirements are met. Sometimes the program elimination decision has to be you can discontinue enrollment in new entry into a program, but it might take 2-3 years to teach those students out. So the difficulty here is very serious in terms of the length of time that we have an obligation to our students compared to the length of time we have to execute budget reductions if those take place.
And so would the exigency at all allow you guys a way around the teach-out requirement, or would that sort of be in place?
I haven't had a chance to ask a question before I look for any follow-up. Okay, so I open up for a chance for some last follow-up questions here.
Yeah, again, Dan Bross, KUAC Radio. President Johnsen, given that there was the possibility of this happening at some level, veto at some level, how much or what type of feedback have you had from legislative leaders or just legislators in general that, we've got you, we'll try to override this?
We're getting really positive feedback from those legislators who've been our supporters for years and who voted for our budget here. Now, many of them did vote for our budget, but as you know well, an override requires a 3/4 vote of the legislature. So we are hearing real strong voices of support today from legislative friends, and we'll just need to get to work with our allies, alumni, and business leaders to get with those legislators who are maybe on the fence at this point.
Was there any indication from those who are behind you that this is serious enough at this level that they'll likely be able to achieve the 3/4 threshold?
There was not a projection or an estimation of the likelihood of success, but there were very strong statements of we will do whatever it takes. So really strong statements that we appreciate very much.
So, given that
President Johnsen, this is... Sorry, go ahead.
Given that we've discussed the financial exigency and the options we have for program reviews following there not being an override, what are the university's further options should an override not happen?
Well, the financial exigency will give us the tools to make a lot of really tough decisions. closing campuses, closing programs, ending services. We will have to lay off a lot of people if this veto is not overridden. And our programs and our campuses are all people, basically. There are a lot of those decisions that will be required.
I just had a quick question. This is Tegan with ADN about tuition. Can tuition still be increased for the fall semester, or can you talk about what impacts to tuition could possibly be?
Thank you. We already have in place a planned 5% tuition increase for the fall. When we were thinking about options, and this was actually in the plan that we were going to discuss with the board today before this big veto was announced, we were going to ask the board to consider an additional 5% increase, but to take effect in the spring of 2020 as opposed to the fall. And one of the things that guided us in that direction is because I've really made a strong commitment and believe in the commitment to our students to give them an opportunity for feedback and to give them a voice in consideration of what they pay for their education. So the plan this fall was to propose a tuition increase for next year in September, talk about it with our student leaders over the fall, and then ask the board for an approval in November. In this case, however, we may need to expedite that. So it's definitely on the table. Of course, this is a balance. We're trying to make sure that we're as accessible and as affordable as we possibly can be, given how important higher education is for Alaskans, and given that we have a very high percentage of our students who are first-time college going, and also adult students, and who are price sensitive. And so we don't want to price ourselves out of the market. So it is on the table, but it's got to be something that's done in balance with other decisions.
I had a quick other question if no one else does. President Johnsen, you talked about, I think at the Regents meeting, about how this will be devastating for the economy, the veto. I was just hoping you could kind of further explain that, realizing the job cuts, but can you talk about how else this would impact the state's economy?
Sure.
If the veto stays?
Well, I think the job cuts are a big one, and these people, we've lost population in Alaska 6 years in a row. So the idea that these folks are going to walk across the street and start up yet another drive-through espresso stand is very unlikely. So this will expedite the downward trend in demographics here in Alaska, taking away that talent and the purchasing power out of our economy. The second is that we provide about 90% of the workforce development education in Alaska, a little bit over 90%. So hitting us this way from a budget standpoint reduces our ability to educate a highly skilled workforce for employers here in Alaska. It also may have a very negative effect on the research that we do here in the state. Applied research for the oil and gas industry, for the mining industry, for the fishing industry. So all of those industries would also be negatively affected by a decline in the capacity we have to solve very real problems that those industries are facing. It'll also limit our ability to fund and commercialize intellectual property. The ideas and the inventions that our faculty come up with, our staff come up with, will be constrained in our ability to diversify the state's economy as a result of this. So those are just a few examples. We also have real challenges in Alaska in terms of college going. And cuts like this may have the effect of driving the rate of our high schoolers going on to college even further down, lower than it already is. And that'll have a long-term negative impact on the state. if you look at those states, and I know you have, Tegan, those states that have really strong economies and strong knowledge economies, they all have really high educational attainment, and they all have very strong university systems. So I think we are a driver for economic development, and by cutting our budget, we are going to impact in a very negative way the state's economic future.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all again for calling in today. There is information for the media posted at the link that was on our media advisory. If you need that from me, I can be contacted again at mmusic@alaska.edu, or you can call me at